Lecture 5. Solon. Democracy begins. 594 BC.
We come now to the fifth of our lectures, discussing 36 events that have changed history. And in our first four lectures, we discussed seminal events in the classic civilizations of the ancient Middle East, of India, and of China. And in all of these areas of the world, classical Middle East, China, and India, the political form was that of absolute despotism. Hammurabi issued a law that made the government under the law, and yet at the same time he issued this as an absolute ruler. No Senate or House of Representatives supervised it. It was all came directly from Hammurabi under the guise of his having been given it by the absolute god Marduk. In fact, Egypt, as we said, in its language, doesn't even have a word for freedom. But even in the language of Hammurabi, in Akkadian, the word for freedom essentially means liberties, in the sense of something that the absolute ruler gives you, but can take away any time without any reason. And of course, in our second lecture on the Ten Commandments, God is the absolute ruler of the Israelites. And when they finally choose a king, God allows them to choose a king. That king rules as an absolute despot under the power of God. And of course, the Ten Commandments are absolute commandments. There's no mechanism in the Ten Commandments for amending them. So it is absolute despotism that has marked the Middle East from the birth of civilization there in 3000 BC, right on down until the 20th century. And in India, Buddha himself cared nothing about government, but the government of India, from its beginnings all the way down until the collapse of the British Empire, was marked by absolute despotism, absolute rule. And ideas of democracy were brought into India by the British. And China, from the beginning of its civilization around 1700 BC, right on down until the present, it has been a nation that has known only absolute despotism. So that might suggest to us that freedom is not a universal value. That people in many places and in many times have chosen the perceived advantages and security of an absolute ruler over the awesome responsibility of self-government. In fact, democracy was born in Greece, and it can be argued, and I believe argued very strongly, that no nation has ever understood democracy unless it was touched by the genius of the Greeks. And democracy came to Greece in the 6th century BC. Now, Greece is another of the classic civilizations, and in fact, the birth of civilization in Greece came about at roughly the same time as it did in India and in China around 1700 BC. And I'm not sure that all of this is coincidental. That is to say, I believe that there were mutual influences working all this time. But around 1700 BC, the Greeks began to write. They began to build monumental structures, above all the great palaces that still rise up at sites like Mycenae and Tiryns and Pylos in Greece today. Began to write, build monumental architecture, use bronze weapons, and develop complex governmental structures. And this was the society described by Homer. This was the Greece that launched its ships against ancient Troy. Now, Homer was not a contemporary of this society. The Trojan War occurred about 400 years before Homer, but he describes it with remarkable detail. And that was the first great age of Greece, and it was an age of kings. It then collapsed under foreign invaders, and for almost 500 years, Greece was in a dark age. We know almost nothing about it. Writing died out, the great palaces fell into ruin. But around 700 BC, Greece emerged from this dark age. Writing began anew with a whole different alphabet, the Greek alphabet that we're familiar with. And the Greeks colonized large areas of the Mediterranean world, all the way from the Black Sea, indeed from the Crimea of the Ukraine today, all the way out to France. Marseille, for example, was originally a Greek colony. And the whole of this vast area of the Mediterranean and Black Sea was one economic unit, divided into a number of smaller city-states, but one great economic unity, a true Mediterranean global economy. And Greece, by the year 700 BC, was becoming part of an even larger economic unit. And Greece participated fully in the axial age that marked the birth of Buddhism in India and the rise of Confucius in China. That period we described as running roughly from 583 BC with the birth of Buddha down to 399 BC with the death of Socrates. And this axial age was part of an economic unit. All the way from China, out not only to Greece, but across the Mediterranean to cities like Marseille, there were trade routes. Silks from China could pass all the way across this Silk Road through what are today the Central Asian republics, all the way across Iraq, through what we would call Turkey, and then on to Greece. And not just materials went along this route, but ideas went along this route. And out of this interchange of commerce, this true global economy, and this interchange of ideas, we see the same fundamental religious notion of the transmigration of souls developing in Greece under the influence of India. And Socrates would believe profoundly in the transmigration of souls and in an afterlife in which you were judged on the basis of your actions. That is to say, in which you fulfilled your karma just the way the Buddha had described. So Greece was part of an economic unit, and in that economic unit, probably around 650 BC, was developed coinage. Now let's stop just for a minute and think about coinage. Now, monetary units had existed for centuries, but they were based on weighing out of silver and gold. A coin is something different. It is a very portable means of carrying about your financial wealth. It is a piece of gold or silver that is struck by the ruler or the state, has a mark on it that indicates who the ruler is, and who thus guarantees that this piece of silver is worth the amount stated upon it. Let's say it is worth 1 sheep for 1 silver coin. Coinage was almost certainly developed in a major part of this economic route in Lydia. Lydia was a powerful kingdom in the 6th century BC and in the 7th century BC as well. It had large amounts of gold and silver, and it was probably the rulers of Lydia, the kings of Lydia, who first struck coinage. But it was very rapidly adopted by the Greek cities that traded with Lydia. Now, coinage, in its own day, in this global economy, played a role very much like credit cards today. That is to say, in the past, if you wanted to buy something, you wanted to buy a plow, you took down to the plow maker a sheep or 2 sheep, whatever he wanted for his plow. Well, it's very cumbersome, carrying this sheep along and having to feed the creature on the way, and might die on you. But a coin was different. You just put that in your little purse, and you went down and put it in front of the plowman, and he had his solid coin. He knew how much it was worth. He didn't have to worry about your selling him a sick sheep. And so, not only did trade expand, not only did the economy boom, but there also grew up a large class of merchants Men who made their living not by raising crops, as had been traditional in Greece and in Athens, but by simply selling goods. And sometimes bringing in with them other merchants to form a kind of joint stock operation. And then they got the idea, of course, that they could borrow money. And also ordinary people got the idea that, well, they could borrow money and pay it back in this coinage. And it made it very easy to arrange debts. And in Athens, which was already one of the major city-states of Greece, in the latter part of the 7th century, a very large number of citizens fell into debt. You see, you went to your local merchant and you said, I'd like to borrow just about 5 silver coins, worth about 5 sheep, in order to buy another field. And he would loan that to you, and you'd buy that field. But you would put up as collateral your crop for the next year. So you had your 5 coins. You went and bought that new field and planted it and thought, with this new field, you're going to have a surplus to pay back your debt and maybe even to borrow some more money. Well, of course, it didn't work out that way. There was a drought. You went to the merchant and said, well, I really can't pay you back this year. What's the minimum amount I can pay on my debt? And he said, well, the minimum amount you can pay is you're going to have to sell one of your children to me as a slave. I can't do that. Well, you don't have the grain to pay it back. Under the law, I am able to take anything from you in payment of that debt. I want that child. Oh, okay. So one child becomes a slave. An Athenian citizen, but she's now a slave. Well, the next year you've got to make the money back, don't you? So you borrow more money. And you pledge your wheat crop. But that fails again. So a second child is taken. And this happened in actuality. Finally, what have you got left? Well, my wife. So you barter your wife away. And ultimately, you yourself will be sold as a slave because you can't pay your debts. Now, you talk about getting into serious debt trouble and having to have some firm get you out of debt trouble. That was worse because you were a slave and could be sold anywhere outside of Athens. So a large number of Athenians were enslaved. Well, of course, some people thought this was a bad system and rose up against it. And Athens was on the verge of civil war, largely between one political party, led by the merchants who liked this system of easy money and debts, and farmers who believed that money should be sound and solid and were opposed to the idea that they could end up in slavery because their crop hadn't been made. And throughout Greece in this period, there were civil wars brought about by this same economic crisis, this debt and mortgage crisis. That's what it was, a debt and mortgage crisis in its own terms and in relative sense, just like what the United States underwent and much of the world did in the year 2007, and which is with us still in the year 2009. So this debt and mortgage crisis produced civil war in a number of cities of Greece and frequently resulted in dictators who assumed power, ruled absolutely, but brought the political parties together and managed to solve the debt crisis. So this was the situation in Athens in 594 BC. And the Athenians, rather than turning to civil war or a dictator, asked one of their leading citizens and a merchant, Solon, to become governor of Athens with the title of Archon. And they put absolute power in his hands. In fact, he was told, you are such a good man, we would most appreciate it if you would declare yourself a dictator. That is probably the only way out of this situation. And at least we will have a dictator we have chosen rather than one that rises to power through war, civil war. Well, Solon had made a very great deal of money. He was about 40 years of age when he became Archon in 594 BC. He was what the Greeks would call one of the 7 wise men of this era, an era that included, and one of the wise men was Pythagoras, who, deeply influenced by India, taught the transmigration of souls. And Solon was another one of these wise men. But part of their wisdom was being practical. Pythagoras himself developed a geometrical theorem, didn't he? And Solon was a wise man who had learned much from his travels. He was a merchant. He had traveled all through this global economy. And one of his favorite sayings in his poetry, because he wrote poems, one of his favorite sayings was, "Grow older every day, and every day learn something new." So Solon developed a great deal of wealth, understood how to master this new economic system, was a poet who could use his beautiful poetry to present his political eyes to his fellow citizens in Athens. And the first thing he did was to declare, "I am not going to be a dictator. I am going to solve this political issue, and then I am going to step back from all power." One of his poems said, "People thought I was a fool. I was offered absolute power, and I turned it down. Well, I would rather be just and trustworthy and follow the path that is right than have all the power in the world and all the wealth." So his first step, as it should be the first step of any political leader in an economic crisis, was to solve that economic crisis. And the crisis was, of course, that there were these huge debts. Many people were enslaved as a result of these debts, and the creditors wanted their money. They had essentially, through this debt and mortgage crisis, brought the Athenian economy to a standstill. And Solon made one clear, strong decision, knowing that it would please no one completely, but it was the just thing to do. First of all Athenian citizens who had been enslaved were declared free. And the Athenian government paid to bring back and buy out of slavery all those Athenians who have been sold outside of Athens. So the complete abolishment of slavery for Athenian citizens. And from then on, no Athenian citizen could sell himself or sell his wife or children into slavery. The second thing, though, was to abolish debts altogether. And all outstanding debts were canceled. Well, this aroused the fury of those who owned all of these slaves and owned all of this debt. But it was done. And of course, as with any political leader who makes hard decisions, Solon was slandered. And it was claimed entirely falsely that he had told several of his best friends that he intended to abolish all debts. They had borrowed a great deal of money, bought a great deal of land, and suddenly they didn't have to pay it. Well, that was just a lie. And Solon used his poetry to say, if you do the right thing, you'll be slandered. So slavery was abolished. And the next step then was to prevent this kind of reoccurrence and to give Athens a government that would permit the people to be free and to stop this exploitation by a few very wealthy individuals, but at the same time recognize that those who have the most money have the biggest stake in the government. So Solon sat down and created a written constitution for Athens. One of the first times that had ever been done in Greece, probably the first time, a written constitution, so that ever thereafter, Athenian citizens could stand before the great scrolls on which this constitution was published, there in the public assembly hall of Athens, and read what the law was. And this constitution was a balanced democracy. Democracy, what does the word mean? It means demos, the people, and kratia, power. And democracy is simply the power of the people. We, the United States, we are a democracy. I hear people say, no, we're a republic. Well, that's nonsense. Constitution starts off, we the people. to ordain and establish this constitution. And republic, that is just the Latin form of democratia, res publica. And res publica means simply in Latin, the thing of the people, the power of the people. So we're a democracy, and it was there in Athens that the first true balanced democracy was born by Solon in 594 BC in response to this debt and mortgage crisis. Now, the balanced democracy gave the people, all the citizens of Athens, of course just the men, because part of being an Athenian citizen was the obligation to serve in the military. And since women did not serve in the military, they were not full citizens. They were passive citizens, to use a term that the founders of our country were familiar with. That is to say, they had the protection of the laws, but they did not make the laws. But all Athenian citizens were granted the right to vote. And all Athenian citizens were granted the right to serve on a jury. And every Athenian citizen had the right to sue anybody they wanted to bring a legal suit against anybody they wanted to. And for Solon and for the Athenians, these were the real essence of democratic power, that the people can vote and that the people can serve on a jury, and you have a right to a trial by jury under Solon, and the jury will be composed of your peers, not some judge as under Hammurabi, but a jury of your peers finds you guilty or innocent. And thirdly, you can sue people. They can't do harm to you without your being able to strike back. And the Athenians became proud of being the most litigious of all the Greeks, bringing as many suits as they could. And you loved being on jury because there you had power, and there also you got to see these wonderful lawsuits being fought out. But governmental office was regarded as a very great responsibility, which most Athenian citizens neither wanted nor were capable of doing. And very much on the up and up, openly, those who were wealthiest held the highest offices in Athens, but they had to be elected by their fellow citizens. So at the very top was a group called the 500 bushel men, was their a Greek name, but we might call them the billionaires. These were people who were worth $1 billion. And they could hold the very highest office in Athens, like archons, what Solon had been. There were 9 of them elected each year. Then there were those who were worth about $1 million a year. And they were called the knights, because $1 million a year or 300 bushels was enough to allow you to have a horse. And they then formed the cavalry of ancient Athens. And they could hold slightly lower offices. And then there were those who were worth around, let's say $500,000 a year. And they called themselves the working people. Their official name came from the term to yoke an ox to a wagon. They were the ones who really carried Athens. They were by far the largest. And then under them, every other Athenian citizen was just called a citizen, and they had only the right to vote, serve on juries, and sue people, but could not hold any political offices. So that was the balanced constitution of Athens, and that was a true democracy, in that the right to vote and the right to come together and make laws rested with the people as a whole. And moreover, Solon established a supreme court. All the Athenians could vote on any law, but once that law had been passed, this supreme court, made up of men who had held the highest office, they then could declare it unconstitutional. Having made his laws, Solon then turned to the Athenian people and said, for 10 years, I don't want you to change this law, this constitution I have given you. And the Athenians agreed to do this, but to make sure the Athenians didn't keep pestering him and demanding that he hold more public office or intervene in any quarrels that arose or disputes over the Constitution, he just traveled. Traveled to Egypt, stayed away from Athens for 10 years, even meeting with the great king of Lydia, Croesus, in a story made immortal by Herodotus. And when Croesus, the richest man in the world, asked Solon, who is the happiest man in the world, thinking it would be him, instead Solon, true to form, named two sets of men who had both lived good long lives, had enough money to be content but weren't wealthy, and died in the service of their country. And to him, that was what made you happy. And he warned Croesus, no one is happy until the end is known. You're only lucky up until this point. And Croesus would not listen to him and fall from power in a catastrophic fashion. Now, to the founders of our country, Solon was a model. One of the favorite readings of Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, George Washington, was the life of Solon as told by Plutarch. And for them, he was the model of a true statesman who came to aid his country in its time of need, gave it the laws it needed, a democracy that was balanced, and then stepped back. Now, we fought our revolution, and by 1783, we had defeated the greatest empire of its day, the superpower of its day. We had gained a territory reaching all the way out to the Mississippi. And yet, by 1787, it seemed as though this great effort at liberty would fail. By 1787, these new United States, each of them still 13 separate sovereign republics. Remember, the treaty with the British did not recognize the United States of America. It recognized the independence of New Hampshire, Virginia, New York, South Carolina, Georgia, each of the 13 republics. They were sovereign, they were jealous of one another, and they were in economic turmoil. And in the fall of that year, fall of the year 1786, there broke out in western Pennsylvania, western Virginia, a terrible debt and mortgage crisis. These men who had served so bravely in the Revolution had been paid in scrip issued by the Continental government, issued by the government of the United States. And this scrip was refused by their wholesalers. They would go to rebuild their farms, want to buy a plow, want to buy seed corn, and had their scrip refused. And this started a debt and mortgage crisis in which these brave men from the Revolution all through the 13 states began to lose their farms, be foreclosed upon. And their local stores began to close because there was no credit. And the whole credit market froze all the way from western Pennsylvania, all the way up to Boston, all the way to London, all the way to Amsterdam. This in the fall of 1786. And in the spring of that year, 1787, in May of that year, out of their need to respond to this debt and mortgage crisis, 55 delegates sent by 12 of the states, Rhode Island wouldn't send one, it liked easy money, came to Philadelphia, and there in the course of one summer, from May the 25th to September the 17th, gave us the Constitution which the American people would ratify, a balanced democracy in which the will of the people is balanced by a strong executive and by a Supreme Court. That achievement grew directly out of the response of true statesmen to a debt and mortgage crisis. So Solon in ancient Athens in the 6th century BC and the founders of our country in the 18th century who put the Constitution in place, then gave it to the American people to ratify, and then allowed it to function. They could have become dictators as well, but they, like Solon, chose the path of democracy and true statesmanship.